The Beastly Echoes of Necropedia by L.P. Melling. I must make it very clear from the start. My name is Kyle Warren. These words are not my own, the style belonging to one long dead, and I am powerless to change that as I recount what happened. The twisted story began with my finding of a sinister tale, which for the life of me I wish I had never had the misfortune of stumbling upon online. That evening, utilizing various genealogy websites, I researched the dark history of my great-grandfather for some hours, and needed a rest from the mental and emotional exertions it entailed. Shamed by what I'd learned, I had to focus my mind elsewhere. Thus, Googling and consulting Necropedia to pass away the time, as many others had done themselves, I selected an entry on beasts, of which there were a number of links that cross-referenced the veracity of others. Buried deep within these, after hours of locked-eyed reading, I came across an entry that I noted had been added on the same date. It was therefore odd that the story to which it led me was one penned by a John Clement in the year 1813. The reasons why such an entry, with its antiquarian origin, had only recently been added could only be guessed upon, but its contents sucked at my heart and soul with horrors my mind had formerly not been burdened with. What was stranger still about the chain of events that followed was, upon later checking the website the following day, the entry had been taken down, expunged from the internet, but never from my mind. Although it has now been almost a year since I read that venomous tale which seared itself into my memory, I know now it can never be exuviated, and will haunt me for the rest of my days. Indeed, using the last of the Emory University's redundancy money I'd received, it later precipitated thousands of air miles in order to hunt down the mystery of Clement's tale. A learned man and an eminent natural historian, Clement recounted how things changed forever for him when he moved to the northwest of England, bringing his loyal Weimaraner with him to the Lake District. He took up residence in a modest cottage in the area and was funded by an eccentric lord by the name of Kelsey, who had given up one of his own properties to Clement so that he could carry out a task that was said to be of utmost importance. Upon the cruel and untimely death of Clement's wife to consumption, financial struggles started to creep into his life, and as he admitted in his account, this was undoubtedly why he jumped at the opportunity with little forethought. Clement told how he watched his true love waste away, her skin clinging to her bones as she screamed at him to help her, the illness darkening her mood beyond that he thought possible. She scathingly attacked his family name for the crimes they had committed in the New World, for the secured cargo his great-grandfather transported there from Africa. Still haunted by the memory of her, he had to have a change in his life, and this was it. I could not help but pity Clement for this. Across the deep and murky waters of the district, lakes had been said to turn as salted as seawater overnight, and cracks in the earth to have opened maw-like upon embankment and tributary. Yet, with Clement's first wanderings around his new place of residence, he saw little in the way of other people, and those he did come across had tongues that grew slow and silent when asked if they experienced any strange happenings on the lakes. Stranger still, and mentioned only in passing by Lord Kelsey, Clement found evidence from the work of the property's former occupant, Philip Humphrey. Kelsey confirmed that Humphrey had carried out some research, but had gone mad after a year of isolation in the place, ending in his suicide. The cottage was many miles away from any village, town, or neighbor, and the lonely feel of the place, with its creeks and abandoned rooms, gave credence to such an account. Even more so, the journal discovered by Clement showed clearly that the hand that had written it belonged to one who had lost all reason and sanity. The lexicon used therein esoteric and incomprehensibly arranged. It included such odd coinages as internet, multiculturalism, and necropedia that no one else at the time had heard of. For the latter, one could imagine it was an encyclopedia of the dead, Yet after sustained efforts on Clement's part, he was unable to find such a book. And in the shewing of some of the words to a friend and leading philologist, he could deduce neither sense nor meaning from such terms. There was talk of being online in Humphrey's journal, but no mention of what type of line this was. The thought of a book tied to a line is verging on the facetious, he wrote, but the journal, regardless of such odd terminologies, filled one only with a sense of unedifying dread. Clement had read of Humphrey's visits to the banks of the misted lakes in the district, a baying sound dogging his every step, and the noisome splashes close to the dark water's edge, as if created by some large sea beast of the night. A time when he said his nightmares had become cold realities as he rushed from his pursuer. His heart froze black. The sound, like a giant hound breathing down his neck, but belonging to something altogether different and more horrid. The hideous parts of different beasts formed together as one atrocity. Thereafter the scrawl becomes illegible, Clement explained, and it was said by Lord Kelsey that Humphrey forever heard the sounds of vicious barking. Like myself, Clement was disturbed by what he'd read, but he was keen to chase this mystery to the same lake's edge the following eve. He could not be certain he was in the same location, so he circumnavigated the lake in search of it with his jet-black dog, Rufus. It was on his second cycle that he too thought he heard a splash, his oil lantern revealing a dark and twisting eddy, the boiling of black lake water only feet from where he stood. At first, he thought he had imagined such sounds, sleep deprivation seeding dark imaginations to run riot in his mind. But as he held his breath, he heard the unmistakable sound of another dog, much larger than Rufus, but rather than the usual bark and growl response that Rufus was so keen to demonstrate, his faithful companion started to whine and whimper, causing a pricking on Clement's neck that penetrated his bones. Racing home, he did not venture forth into the blackness the following night, but waited for daylight 2 mornings hence to resume his investigation. Upon returning to the lapping water's edge, his nerve deserted him, despite the cloud-muted light. Rufus, however, seemed to be back to his usual self, chasing crows and yomping over hill and wet channel. The enthusiastic barking filled the air and Clement's heart with good cheer. This was instantly shattered by a shaking of the ground beneath foot and paw. A black furrow ran foul across the land for over 60 feet, and he knew not if it was his shuddering or the earth that was now making him shake. Rufus scampered to his owner, unsure of whether to stay or flee, his hackles up. But loyalty gave out as he barked an assault against the breaking world. Clement called for him to follow as he fled away from the fractured earth. Rushing ahead of Rufus, a piercing yelp clamped onto Clement's temples. Turning around, he saw his dog had fallen into a newly created hole. The embedded rock cloven at either side of the gaping hole, it looked like hellish teeth as the earth shook again and swallowed his friend whole. The screams of the dog echo still, Clement wrote, but worse soon came to follow as a ferocious howling drowned out every other noise, and the sky turned black, the blood-red sun eclipsed by the moon. The lightless air prickled with cruelty as a false night descended around him, so Clement knew no longer what was star-blotted sky and what was dark water. A charnel stench festered in his nasal cavity. He said that the lake began to boil and froth in a violent frenzy, and he saw his wife step out of the water, her face gaunt, ebon skin paled by decay, peeling as she pointed an accusatory finger at him. She took her skin at the jawline and ripped it from her face, revealing a tentacled head, its cranial limbs writhing en masse and glowing poisonous green. Clement ran. Birds swallowed by night began to rend the air with bird squawk, fleeing as much as he. Limbs bleeding after scratches from bramble and fall, Clement slammed the cottage door behind him. He shuddered the entire night, no longer knowing what was but a dark dream in what was dark reality. He saw shadowy visions of the future, or so he thought, where innumerable advancements had changed the world, more akin to alchemy than science. He saw race equality achieved, but then angrily snatched back from people of all types, as hate grew and grew, the wickedness of man seeming to advance as fast as the technology. And those words from Humphrey's journal, so strange and out of kilter with the world, began to take on meaning for Clement, to make complete sense where everything else in the world no longer did. It made him question his own sanity. Were they the only two in an otherwise ignorant world, he wondered, and thus, being the minority, would always be considered to be anything but compos mentis. The barking was relentless. With his dreams forever blackened by the sight of his lifeless wife and giant hound and sea fiend, Clement had to flee the property. He hastily scrawled a letter to Kelsey, stating that he resigned post-hence and paid for a horse and carriage to convey him as far away as possible from the cosmic horrors of the Lake District. That was almost a year ago, Clement explained in his account, but he made clear that he would forever be haunted by what he saw, and that in every shadow lurked twisted shapes of the foul creatures he found at the lakes. His last journal entry told how he knew the time was near when he would be taken by the darkness. The dark beast awoken inside of him, the guilt he felt for his wife Rosa, eating the last of him away. I can still see Clement's final entry I'd read online, each word clawing at my mind, cutting into my heart as he begged God for mercy. What struck me most, however, was not so much the final words themselves, but their arrangement, which took on an increasingly 21st century pattern of phrasing, akin to my own customary style, and out of place with that which came before it, as if it had been written today in 2013. Unable to concentrate on anything else for days afterward, I delved into further research of the Lake District and started to make inquiry about flights to Manchester, England from my home city of Atlanta. I had to know more about this poisonous tale. I had to unmask the mystery. Booking my ticket in a family name that had been changed by political necessity to purge the sins committed in generations past, I began my expedition. The flight was uneventful. Looking back, I can see without doubt that I did not feel any increased sense of dread, although I know I should have, mindful of what dark and sordid intertextual tale was to come. I had almost booked a flight with a stopover in London, and now wished I had, because the peace I felt on that flight and from my cab ride to the Cumbrian Lakes was one I will never know again. A time when my hands stayed still, my flesh fulsome and clinging clean to my bones. The gaunt face I see today, with deep holes for eye sockets, is nothing like that which I saw in the confined spaces of the plane's lavatory at high altitude. The cottage was easier to find than I know it should have been, although I had cross-referenced the location and used every online tool at my disposal. The bones of the house had been reclaimed by nature. Overgrown ivy nested around the outer walls. The roof was moss-covered, weeds of every family beastly high around its base. Indeed, I know not how I found it there, and wonder if some tenebrous force was leading me to that place all along. After cutting through the intense greenery, my brow sodden and night beginning to fall, I finally had access to the door and pushed it hard to open its secrets. The creaking of the door's hinges cut into my ears, and the milky twilight filled the void before me. I used the torch application on my telephone device to burn away the remaining shadows that lay inside. The place seemed as if no living thing had been present in all the years that stretched between Clement and me. Indeed, how I had pictured it in my mind was almost a carbon copy of the layout, a lifeless gray chiaroscuro of a dwelling. The dead air that had been collecting all those decades assaulted my nostrils, filling them with the decaying, fetid breath of forgotten times. Bone-chilling stillness pervaded the room. I hesitated and thought of calling a cab back to Kendal, where I could sup fine ale and enjoy the warm company of the local inhabitants in a town not 10 miles away. The driver had told me at length about this, making his recommendation of a new inn he frequented and favored. The call of such warmth to flee from the cold now gathering beneath my skin was too much. Thus, I brought up my recent contacts and called the same cab firm. However, the dial tone rang clear for only one bell before abruptly being cut off. I retried the number, but found there was no signal. I had expected this to some extent, for this was a place far removed from other residencies. My signal had been fine upon exiting the cab, so I walked further away from the cottage and endeavored to find a better spot, and tried to call the number again and again. My efforts were futile, achieving nothing but a drained battery, now at an emergency low level. There was nothing for it. I had to either walk the dark roads alone or stay in the accursed cottage that filled me with fear. Pushing down my cowardice, I re-entered the property and used my torch to light the way. In the corner was the desk I noticed earlier, with a drawer that I took to be locked. Nonetheless, on wrenching the knob with some force, it opened. A journal lay inside the drawer, its tan cover marbled from watermarks, yet there seemed no further damage to it despite the long years. I carefully and gently placed it on the desk and opened it up to the first page. The uncanny familiarity of its words grew with each one read. Then it struck me. The words were the exact ones I'd read online. But how? How could it be? As if the journal had been trapped here for years, how could Clement's journal have been posted online? Sweat poured off me as my mind ached with it all. Then my battery gave a final warning signal, the light cutting out on a page stained with blood, the fingerprint burning into my eyes long after the illumination was gone. The creak of the door, its deafening slam, froze my soul in place. I raced toward the door, struggling to breathe. Gripping hard, I pulled with all my might, but it would no longer budge. I prayed to everything merciful, to all the gods I knew, and at last the door gave way. I fell, for an eternity it seemed, until I landed on solid floor. I stood, decaying floorboard groaning beneath my feet, and ran out of the cold cottage. I thought surely I would twist my ankle, unable to see anything beyond an arm's length in front of me, but then a cloud moved away to reveal a gibbous moon. Its strong light lit the pathway ahead, and it led me deep into the woods, without any sign of a safer road back to civilization. I rushed down this ragged-cut path until it declined steeply, and there was a sudden change in the air. It was less humid somehow. Then my dulled senses realized why, as the lake's water glinted with moonlight. I knew now what I had to do. Follow the embankment, what seemed like a giant shore, to its end. There would be boathouses along the way, shops close by, even the odd inn. After all, the area was known for its visitors. All I had to do was find one to shelter me from this fitful state. But I was keenly aware of the memories my current locale brought up. Not of my own, no, of Clement's, of the memories I'd read that had filled me with dread. I pushed them out of my mind as much as I could, though they resurfaced like foul creatures I imagined lurking just below the murky surface of the lake, despite its stillness. I yearned to find a similar calm in myself as I broadened my stride along the embankment. The jagged peaks of Skullfell Pike jutted into the sky, looming monstrous in the distance. Its outline appeared as cruel-cut teeth. I felt the walls of its solid rock closing in on me as I hurried on. I was hastened by the sight in the far distance of some illuminated building, which I took to be an internet cafe or something of its ilk. I began to run, latching onto the hope of a warm place to retreat from the increasing cold. Despite the distance I covered over the next 10 minutes, the illuminated building seemed to come no closer to me. I struggled to breathe a moment, slowing down to halt when I sensed something behind me. It was then that I heard the sound of a dog crying for mercy, ululating raw. one I knew could only be that of the black dog that had been Clement's loyal companion. I looked over my shoulder as I ran, but saw nothing. Nothing was there. It was then, eyes no longer focused on the ground in front of me, that I lost my footing, tripped over a jagged rock. I tried to stand, but couldn't. I rubbed at my eyes, seeing nothing in the moonlight, and I knew it could only be my troubled mind. Now fraying at the edges, infected by other stories, by the surrounds that had started to bleed into my dreams since that day I clicked on the link to read a story I never should have. The moon, which had been kind in lighting my way, was choked by cloud cover. The world turned black around me, and I could no longer see where the murky water began or ended, where the dark sky ceased to be. As if everything had been turned upside down, dizziness took me. A godlike splash echoed into the night, and a shrieking of birds from somewhere out of sight pierced my eardrums. I called for help to the fading light of what I thought had been a building, my salvation, but now I knew it had been nothing but a trick of the light. I had to rise, and so I did, limping and shaking like some lame colt, trying to flee the sounds that would not abate. I froze mid-step, when up nearby something large and black emerged from the murky water. The flicking of tentacles from its giant mouth confirmed my fears. Darkness surrounded it, but nothing could be as black as its opened giant maw, an abyss eager to take my soul. It dragged itself towards me, covered in weeds, slime-coated, silt-sullied as if from the bottom of the lake, from the bottom of the earth itself, from the darkest depths of man's imagination. I could not move, only watch. A scream trapped inside my throat stole my breath. Its protean face came closer, became smaller, and I saw it in all its cruelty, the shape of a hooded mask, a pointed top, bright white when new but now algae-stained blue-green. It pulled off its spiteful disguise, clicking out 3 Ks with its mephitic tongue on those 3 hateful words, and I looked upon my long-lost great-grandfather, Clifford Walker, the one that my family, the Deep South, had tried so hard to forget. I do not know where or how I found the power to rise, but I did. My limbs were jellied eels, pain screaming from my ankle. Somehow I scrambled away. For what felt like an eternity, the ungodly noises continued to dog my every step, but I did not turn around. The image of the squamous beast, my great-grandfather's sins incarnate, burned into my mind. At last, I realized the cruel connection between Clement and myself, our family's dark pasts shackled to our souls. I continued to flee the beast, but knew now it was buried deep inside me, like it had been for Clement all those years ago. Only when dawn started to dispel the darkness was the building at last in reach, putting me in mind somehow of an edifice in Druid Hills where I lived. I rushed to the door, wrenched it open, and fell inside, much to the astonishment of the people within. An attendant of the cafe rang me a cab to the airport. I took the next flight available back home, my nerves and mind frayed. The horrific screams of stolen people branded onto my soul. The clock is close to striking midnight, marking 1 year since those events took place, but the same sounds, the same ghastly sights fill my febrile dreams, my waking hours, every labored breath. And as I write, no, as I type this now, my hands shaking, chewed-off fingernails leaving bloody prints on the keys, I'm haunted still by what I saw, writing in a style I do not recognize as my own, in a style not of my own time. No matter how many times I have tried to put down this poisonous tale, it always comes out the same way, as if I'm powerless to control it, and so these will be my final words. Yet, there is one crucial thing I must leave you with, no matter its form, the true purpose of my account, and that is to beg you never to consult that dark section of Necropedia, for it will suck you into its dark heart, enslave you to its malign will. All I can do now is wait to be taken by the shadows that draw closer with every breath, as the beastly echoes claw out the last part of my mind. 404 error. File not found. The URL you requested was not found. Maybe you would like to look at the main page, the list of Necropedia entries under beasts. Connecting. End. Thank you for tuning in to this edition of Cosmic Horror Readings. If you'd like to hear more, please subscribe to the channel or head over to cosmichorrormonthly.com. Enjoy.